It started with a box. A simple, dusty wooden box left on the porch of the Miller family's quaint suburban home. No return address. No markings. Just a box. Jennifer, the youngest of the family, was the first to spot it. Her innocent curiosity led her to peel back the layers of tape, revealing an antique porcelain doll wrapped in a tattered cloth. The doll had striking features: large glassy eyes that gleamed unnaturally, crimson-painted lips frozen in a smirk, and delicate hands that seemed eerily lifelike. Jennifer was enchanted, but her parents, Laura and David, exchanged uneasy glances. "Where did this come from?" Laura asked, inspecting the doll as a chill crept up her spine. "There's no note," David muttered, turning the box over. "Weird." Jennifer named the doll Clara and insisted on keeping it in her room. At first, nothing seemed amiss, but by the second night, strange things began to happen. Jennifer woke up at midnight to a soft creaking sound. Her eyes fluttered open to see Clara sitting on the edge of the shelf, tilted slightly forward, as if watching her. She brushed it off as her imagination and fell back asleep. But the following night, Clara wasn't on the shelf. Instead, she was on the chair across the room, facing Jennifer's bed. "Mom, did you move Clara?" Jennifer asked at breakfast the next morning. "No, honey. Why?" Jennifer hesitated, her fork hovering over her plate. "She's not where I left her." Laura laughed nervously. "You probably forgot. It's just a doll." But Clara's movements became more frequent. Every morning, Jennifer would find the doll in a different spot, sometimes by the window, sometimes on the floor, always positioned to face her. It wasn't long before the whispers began. Late at night, Jennifer would wake up to faint, muffled voices. At first, she thought it was the wind or perhaps the TV from the living room. But the whispers weren't coming from outside her room. They were coming from Clara. She told her parents, but they dismissed her fears. "It's probably just a dream," Laura said. But the whispers grew louder, more distinct. Jennifer began to hear her name being called. "Jennifer, come closer." Terrified, she shoved Clara into her closet and slammed the door. That night, she slept with the lights on. But when she awoke the next morning, Clara was back on the shelf, sitting upright, her glassy eyes gleaming in the sunlight. Jennifer screamed. The doll's presence began to affect the entire family. David started waking up with deep scratches on his arms and legs, as though something with tiny claws had attacked him in his sleep. Laura's cheerful demeanor turned sour. She was constantly on edge, snapping at everyone. And then there were the dreams, dark, vivid nightmares that plagued them all. In these dreams, Clara wasn't a doll, but a living figure, her glassy eyes now filled with malice. She would stand at the foot of their beds, whispering things they couldn't remember upon waking, but left them drenched in sweat. Jennifer begged her parents to get rid of the doll. "Please throw her away. I don't want her anymore." David relented and took Clara to the trash. He made sure to bury the doll deep within the garbage can, slamming the lid shut with a sense of finality. But that night, Clara returned. She was sitting in Jennifer's chair, her head tilted to one side as though amused. "Dad, you brought her back." Jennifer cried. I swear I didn't." David exclaimed, his face pale. Laura's hands trembled as she held the doll. "This is impossible. How is it back?" Desperate, Laura decided to research the doll. She scoured the internet and visited forums about haunted objects. What she found made her blood run cold. Clara was part of a cursed collection, known for binding itself to its owners. Stories from others described the same chilling behavior. Movements, whispers, and dreams. But the worst was yet to come. The doll, it seemed, fed on fear, growing stronger with each passing day. Laura read aloud from an article. The doll must be burned to sever its connection. But beware, destroying it without proper rituals can invite something worse. The family decided they couldn't wait any longer. That night, they built a fire in the backyard. David held Clara over the flames, hesitating as the doll's eyes seemed to meet his. "Do it, Dad," Jennifer yelled, but as the flames licked Clara's porcelain skin, an ear-piercing scream erupted, not from the doll, but from all around them. The fire roared unnaturally high, casting grotesque shadows on the walls of their house. Jennifer screamed, clutching her ears. Laura fell to her knees, sobbing, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fire died down. Clara was gone, reduced to ash. For a while, the house was silent, peaceful. The family started to heal, believing they had defeated whatever malevolent force had plagued them. But 1 month later, Jennifer found another box on the porch, smaller this time, tied with a black ribbon. Her hands trembled as she untied it, revealing another doll, this one with dark hair and a sinister grin. Jennifer dropped the box and screamed, but as she turned to call for her parents, she heard it. "Hello, Jennifer. I've missed you." It all started on a cold, overcast evening. Emily had just finished her late shift at the diner and was walking home, as she always did. The streets were unusually quiet, the air thick with a strange, almost oppressive silence. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, quickening her pace. She first noticed it as she passed a dimly lit alley. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement, a shadow that seemed to shift unnaturally against the wall. She stopped and turned, her heart pounding, but there was nothing there. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself and kept walking. But as she moved, so did the shadow. It wasn't like the other shadows cast by the streetlights. It moved independently, gliding along the walls, stretching and twisting in ways that defied logic. Emily tried to convince herself it was her imagination. She was tired, stressed. That's all it was. But when she reached her apartment building and unlocked the door, she felt it again, that unsettling sensation of being watched. Inside her apartment, Emily locked the door and drew the curtains, her fingers trembling. She told herself she was safe, but the feeling didn't go away. As she moved around her living room, she noticed her own shadow on the wall, but there was something wrong with it. Her shadow wasn't quite in sync with her movements. When she raised her hand, it hesitated for a fraction of a second before mimicking her. When she sat down, it seemed to lean in closer. Emily's breath hitched. She turned on every light in the apartment, trying to banish the darkness. She stayed awake all night, her eyes darting to every shadowy corner. Over the next few days, the shadow became bolder. It didn't just follow her anymore. It started appearing in places it shouldn't. She saw it outside her apartment window on the 3rd floor, pressed against the glass like a dark stain. She saw it on the ceiling above her bed, shifting and writhing as though trying to break free from the surface. She even began hearing faint whispers in the darkness, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere. "Why won't you leave me alone?" Emily whispered one night, tears streaming down her face. The shadow didn't answer, but it moved closer, stretching across the floor toward her. Desperate, Emily confided in her best friend, Lisa. They met at a coffee shop during the day. Emily refused to go out after sunset anymore. "You're probably just overtired," Lisa said, though her tone was uncertain. "Stress can do weird things to your mind." "I'm not imagining this," Emily insisted. "It's real. I can feel it watching me." Lisa sighed. "All right, why don't I stay over tonight? Maybe I can help you figure this out." That night, Lisa came to Emily's apartment armed with snacks and a flashlight. "If this thing shows up, I'll shine a light on it, and we'll see what we're dealing with," she joked, trying to lighten the mood. But as the night wore on, Lisa's humor faded. Around midnight, the temperature in the apartment dropped sharply. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and then they saw it, a dark, shapeless mass crawling along the wall. "What the hell is that?" Lisa whispered, clutching the flashlight. Emily's voice trembled. "That's it. That's the shadow." Lisa flicked on the flashlight and aimed it at the mass. For a moment, it seemed to shrink away from the light, but then it surged forward, more defined than ever. The shadow now had form, twisted, elongated limbs and hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through them. The flashlight flickered and went out. From that night on, the shadow became an inescapable presence. Emily quit her job, too terrified to leave her apartment. She covered every window and mirror, trying to block out any surface where the shadow could appear. But it didn't help. The shadow was always there, lurking in the corners, stretching along the walls. It began whispering her name at all hours. Sometimes, it imitated Lisa's voice or her mother's, calling out to her from the darkness. Emily's health deteriorated rapidly. She barely ate or slept, her eyes constantly darting around the room. She knew she couldn't live like this much longer. One day, as Emily sat huddled in her living room, she heard a knock at the door. She hesitated, her heart racing. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice shaky. "Someone who can help," a deep voice replied. Against her better judgment, Emily opened the door. A tall man in a long coat stood there, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. "You're being followed," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Emily stared at him, stunned. "How do you know?" "I've seen this before," he said. "The shadow. It's not just a figment of your imagination. It's a parasite, feeding off your fear. Can you stop it?" Emily asked, desperation in her voice. The man nodded. "But it won't be easy. Shadows like this are drawn to unresolved guilt or trauma. Whatever it's feeding on, you have to confront it." The man instructed Emily to sit in the center of the room with all the lights off. He lit a single candle and placed it in front of her. "When the shadow appears, don't look away," he warned. "Face it, no matter what it shows you." The room grew darker than Emily thought possible. The candle's flame flickered weakly, barely holding back the suffocating blackness. And then it came, the shadow, rising from the floor like smoke. It loomed over Emily, its hollow eyes staring into her soul. Images flashed before her, painful memories she had buried deep. The car accident that claimed her brother's life, the guilt she felt for surviving when he didn't. Tears streamed down her face as the shadow whispered her darkest fears. "You should have died, not him. You'll never escape this." But Emily, shaking with fear and grief, forced herself to speak. "You're right. I made mistakes. But I won't let you control me anymore." The shadow let out an ear-piercing shriek, its form twisting violently. The candle's flame flared bright, engulfing the room in light. And then, just like that, the shadow was gone. When Emily opened her eyes, the man was gone, and the room was eerily quiet. She felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. Though she would never forget the shadow, she knew she had taken back control of her life. But every now and then, on particularly dark nights, she still feels a faint, familiar presence lurking just out of sight. It was a house like any other, or so it seemed when Anna and her husband Mark moved in. The quaint cottage, nestled on the outskirts of town, was a perfect blend of rustic charm and modern comfort. They had been searching for a fresh start, a quiet place away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The moment they stepped inside, they knew this was their new home. At first, everything was idyllic. The creak of the old wooden floors, the soft hum of the wind through the trees outside. It was peaceful. But it didn't take long before Anna started noticing the strange occurrences. It began with the door to the basement. It was an old, heavy door that led to the dark, musty space below. The door was always locked, and Anna never gave it much thought until one evening when Mark was away for work. She had just finished dinner when she heard a faint creaking sound. She paused, listening intently. It came from downstairs. The door. It was opening. Anna's heart skipped a beat. She stood frozen in place, her eyes fixed on the basement door from the kitchen. The door slowly creaked open, just a crack. Then it stopped. She held her breath, waiting, but there was nothing. Mark returned later that evening, and Anna told him what had happened. He brushed it off as the house settling, a common occurrence in older homes. But Anna couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, as they prepared for bed, Anna couldn't help but glance at the basement door. It was closed now, but she couldn't ignore the feeling of eyes watching her, the weight of something lurking just beyond the door. Around 2 a.m., Anna awoke to a faint sound, like a soft scraping, coming from downstairs. She felt her pulse quicken as she listened closely. There was again the basement door creaking open. This time, she wasn't imagining it. The door was definitely opening. Anna's breath caught in her throat, and she hesitated before getting out of bed. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, her hands shaking. "Mark?" she whispered into the dark, but there was no answer. Mark was fast asleep, unaware of the nightmare unfolding in the house. Anna slowly crept down the stairs, her feet barely making a sound on the wooden steps. The kitchen was dark, and the faint moonlight from the window only added to the eerie atmosphere. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen, her eyes locked on the basement door, which was now wide open. She could feel a cold draft blowing from the basement, and the air smelled damp, musty. She was paralyzed with fear, but something pushed her forward. She had to know what was in the basement. Anna stepped carefully toward the basement door, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Her hand trembled as she reached for the light switch, but just before she flicked it on, she heard something, or rather someone. A whisper. It was barely audible at first, but it was unmistakable. "Come down, Anna." Her breath caught in her throat. She froze, unable to move. The voice sounded so familiar, so comforting, yet there was something off about it, something sinister. "Come down." The whisper came again, this time louder, almost desperate. Anna's heart raced as she took a step back. She couldn't do it. She had to leave, get out of the house, call someone. But her feet wouldn't obey her, and before she knew it, she was slowly descending the stairs. The basement was pitch dark, the air growing colder with each step she took. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she could just make out shapes. Old furniture covered in dust, boxes stacked high, and in the corner, an old rocking chair. The chair was rocking. Anna's breath hitched as she watched the chair move back and forth, as though someone was sitting in it, gently rocking. Her gaze slowly shifted to the corner of the room, where an old mirror hung on the wall. The mirror was cracked, but what caught Anna's attention wasn't the mirror itself. It was the reflection. The basement was empty, or so she thought, but in the reflection, there was someone standing behind her. A figure, tall and dark, almost blending into the shadows. It had no face, just an outline, tall, imposing, and watching. "Mark!" Anna screamed, turning quickly, but the basement was empty. She spun back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. She stepped back, breathing heavily, her chest tightening with panic. The door to the basement slammed shut behind her. The darkness closed in around her, and for the first time, she felt truly trapped. The next day, Anna was a mess. She hadn't slept, and her mind was racing with questions. What was in the basement? Why did the door keep opening by itself? Was she imagining things, or was something truly wrong with this house? She called a local historian to find out more about the house's past. The man, an older gentleman with deep lines etched into his face, listened intently as she recounted the strange events. The house was built in the late 1800s, he told her, but it wasn't always a family home. It was originally owned by a man named Victor Drake. He was a reclusive inventor, known for his strange experiments and unorthodox methods. There were rumors that he had a particular obsession with the door to the basement. He believed that there was something powerful hidden beneath the house, something he could control. Anna felt her skin crawl. What happened to him? Rumor has it, the historian said softly, Victor Drake vanished. No one knows where he went, but the house was abandoned for years after that. People say his spirit still lingers here, trying to finish what he started. Anna's blood ran cold. She had to know more, but she wasn't sure if she could handle the truth. That night, as the wind howled outside, Anna and Mark stayed up late. Mark was still unaware of everything that had been happening, but Anna could no longer ignore it. She had to confront whatever was in the basement, whatever had been calling her. She waited until Mark fell asleep, then tiptoed downstairs again. The door to the basement was wide open, beckoning her. She didn't hesitate this time. She had to face it. As she descended the stairs, the air grew colder. The whispering voice returned, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a roar, a cacophony of voices, all calling her name. Anna! She reached the bottom of the stairs and turned to face the rocking chair. It stopped suddenly still. The basement was silent, except for the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. And then she saw him. Victor Drake, his face twisted and pale, his eyes hollow and empty, stood at the far end of the room, just out of reach of the light. You shouldn't have come here, he said, his voice like gravel. Anna froze, paralyzed with terror. I've been waiting for you, he whispered, stepping closer. You were always meant to finish my work. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, and she was trapped in the basement with the ghost of Victor Drake, his cold hands reaching for her. When Emily and her family moved into the old Victorian house on the edge of town, they were excited. It was spacious, with a sprawling garden and tall, elegant windows that filled the rooms with sunlight. They had heard the house had a rich history, but it was all just stories, nothing more than rumors about past owners and ghostly whispers. However, Emily quickly realized that there was something wrong with this house. It wasn't the creaky floors or the drafts that made her uneasy. It was the whispers. It started slowly at first, just faint voices, barely audible, as though someone was speaking from behind a closed door. Emily assumed it was the wind or perhaps the house settling, a natural occurrence in old buildings. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, more persistent. It wasn't just the whispers that unsettled her. It was the feeling of being watched. Emily often felt like eyes were on her when she was alone in the house. She would turn around, expecting to find someone standing there, but there was never anyone. One night, as Emily was reading in her room, she heard it again, the unmistakable sound of whispers. This time, it wasn't just a random occurrence. It seemed to be calling her name. Emily. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't recognize the voice, and yet, there was something eerily familiar about it. She stood up and glanced around her room, but everything was still. Emily. The voice came again, softer this time, almost like a breath. She stepped toward the door, her feet barely making a sound on the floorboards. The house was silent, save for the whispers. The air felt thick with tension, as though the very walls were holding their breath. The whispers were coming from downstairs. The next day, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling her from the basement. Her curiosity gnawed at her, but there was also a sense of dread. She had heard the stories about the house's previous owner, an elderly woman who had passed away in the basement, alone. The neighbor said she had been a recluse, never seen outside, and there were rumors of strange rituals being held in the basement long before Emily and her family had arrived. Emily couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to find out what was going on. That evening, when her parents were out, Emily ventured down to the basement. The stairs creaked beneath her as she descended, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom of the stairs, the faint sound of whispers surrounded her, but this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus of voices, low, hushed, almost pleading. Her hand trembled as she reached for the light switch, but before she could flip it on, the whispers suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening. Emily stood in the dark, her heart racing. Her eyes scanned the basement, but she couldn't see anything. The air felt heavier now, oppressive, as though the very atmosphere in the room was pressing in on her. And then she saw it. Something moved in the shadows. A figure. It was a fleeting glimpse, but it was enough to send Emily's blood running cold. The figure was hunched over, almost like it was kneeling, its face obscured by darkness. She couldn't make out any details, but she felt its presence. It was there, watching her. Without thinking, Emily bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind her. She stood at the top, gasping for air, her mind racing. She wanted to call her parents, but she knew they wouldn't believe her. What could she say? I saw something in the basement. Her pulse still pounding in her ears. Emily tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. After all, she hadn't actually seen anyone, just a shadow. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Something was in the basement, and it had been calling her. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. The whispers returned, louder this time, as though they were right outside her door. She lay still in bed, her body frozen with fear. She tried to cover her ears, but the whispers seemed to get inside her head, curling in her thoughts like a snake. Emily. Her body trembled as the voice came closer, almost as if the figure from the basement had followed her into the room. The whispers were growing louder, more urgent. Come to us. The next day, Emily could no longer ignore the pull of the basement. It was as if something was forcing her to go down there, to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Every part of her wanted to resist, but the whispers had become a constant presence, tugging at her sanity. That evening, after dinner, she made up her mind. She would go into the basement, face whatever was down there, and end this once and for all. The basement door creaked open, and Emily stepped into the darkness. This time, she didn't hesitate. The voices were louder than ever, and she felt like she was being drawn deeper into their web. Emily, they called, their tone now desperate, pleading. She moved further into the basement, her flashlight illuminating the room. She saw the shadow again, the figure huddled in the corner. This time it wasn't just a shadow, it was a person, an old woman, her face pale and twisted in anguish, her eyes hollow and unblinking. Please, the figure whispered, its voice hoarse and ragged. Help me. Emily stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. The figure reached out toward her, its bony fingers twitching. Help me, it repeated, its voice now a harsh rasp. Emily was paralyzed with fear. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. All she could do was stare at the figure as it dragged itself closer. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and Emily felt herself suffocating under the weight of it. Suddenly, the whisper stopped. The figure froze, staring at Emily with hollow eyes. And then, as if it had never been there, it vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the lingering sense of dread. The next day, Emily couldn't keep the encounter to herself. She had to tell someone, to get help. She sat her parents down and explained everything. The whispers, the figure in the basement, the feeling of being watched. At first, they were skeptical, but after some convincing, they agreed to look into the house's history. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. The previous owner of the house, a woman named Margaret, had been a recluse, much like the rumors had said. She had lived alone for years, her only company the voices in her head. Those who had dared to enter the house in the past spoke of strange occurrences in the basement. Voices, shadows, and inexplicable cold spots. Margaret had been obsessed with something in the basement, some kind of dark ritual she had been performing. No one knew what it was, but many believed she had been trying to communicate with the dead, to open a doorway to the other side. One night, she had disappeared, leaving only the whispers behind. It was said that her soul was trapped in the basement, eternally trying to finish her work. Determined to put an end to the horrors, Emily and her family decided to confront the presence in the basement once and for all. Together, they descended into the depths of the house, the whispers already starting up again. This time, the figure wasn't just a shadow. It was there, standing in front of them, its hollow eyes staring into their souls. The air grew heavy, and the temperature dropped, freezing them in place. Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined. "You're not welcome here. You need to leave." The figure reached out, but this time, Emily wasn't afraid. She spoke the words of a prayer her grandmother had taught her, her voice steady. Slowly, the figure began to fade, its whispers growing softer and softer until they were nothing more than a memory. The air lightened, and the basement grew warmer. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt at peace. The whispers had stopped. The house was finally free. It had only been a few months since Lily and her family moved into the quiet, suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The streets were peaceful, the houses well kept, and the neighbors were friendly. Lily liked it there, away from the noise and bustle of the city. But it wasn't long before she started to notice something strange about one of their neighbors, the old woman who lived across the street in the weathered house at the end of the block. Her name was Mrs. Delilah Marks, a widow who was rarely seen but often heard. Every evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a faint light would flicker from her window, casting long shadows across the front yard. Lily's curiosity got the better of her one evening, and she decided to take a walk down the street, hoping to meet the mysterious neighbor. As she approached the old house, Lily noticed that the front door was slightly ajar, a faint glow spilling out into the darkness. The house, though worn, had an air of quiet elegance. The windows were framed with ivy, and the door had a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head, its eyes gleaming in the fading light. Lily hesitated, then knocked softly on the door. Moments later, Mrs. Marks appeared in the doorway. Her face was wrinkled with age, and her eyes were sharp and cold, as though she had seen far more than she let on. She smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good evening, dear," she greeted Lily in a voice that sounded like dry leaves rustling. "You must be the new neighbor. Come in, come in. I don't get many visitors." Lily, feeling a bit nervous but intrigued, stepped inside. The house was dark, and the air was heavy with the scent of old wood and incense. Mrs. Marks led her into the living room, where a single lamp cast dim light over the room. The furniture was old-fashioned, covered in lace and dust, and there were odd, unsettling trinkets scattered around. Carved wooden figures, strange clocks, and mirrors with cracked glass. "Can I offer you some tea?" Mrs. Marks asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lily nodded, still unsure of what to make of the woman and her strange home. As Mrs. Marks turned to prepare the tea, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was as though the house itself was watching her, every creak and whisper in the walls making her feel uneasy. Over the next few weeks, Lily made a habit of visiting Mrs. Marks every now and then. Each time she went, she noticed something peculiar. Mrs. Marks would seem to be in the same spot, the same chair, as if frozen in time. There was always a faint, almost imperceptible chill in the air, and the house always seemed to be shrouded in an odd, suffocating silence. Lily would try to engage in conversation, but Mrs. Marks rarely responded, her answers often coming in short, cryptic phrases. One evening, after a particularly quiet visit, Lily decided to walk home, but as she passed Mrs. Marks' house, she couldn't help but glance up at the window. She froze. Mrs. Marks was standing there, her silhouette barely visible against the darkened glass. But what caught Lily off guard was the time. She could have sworn she had just left the house moments ago. The next day, Lily decided to ask one of her other neighbors about Mrs. Marks. The elderly man who lived next door to her, Mr. Thompson, was always friendly and outgoing, so Lily figured he might have some insight. "Do you know Mrs. Marks?" Lily asked as she watered her garden. Mr. Thompson paused, his expression hardening for a moment. "Delilah Marks? She's been living there for as long as I can remember. But be careful, Lily. That house has a history." Lily's curiosity was piqued. "What do you mean? What kind of history?" Mr. Thompson glanced around, making sure no one was listening. "It's not a story I like to talk about, but people say that Mrs. Marks isn't really herself, that she's been living alone for decades, and some say she's never left the house. Others say she never ages, no matter how much time passes. I don't know. It's just rumors, I suppose." Lily felt a chill run down her spine, but she tried to dismiss it as just an old man's superstitions. However, that evening, the thoughts of Mrs. Marks' strange behavior lingered in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the entire situation. Several days later, Lily stopped by Mrs. Marks' house again, but this time, something was different. The house was dark. No light flickered from the windows, and the door was closed, as though it hadn't been opened in weeks. Lily felt an odd sense of urgency in her chest as she walked up to the door and knocked. There was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. The silence that followed was suffocating, and Lily felt a strange, nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. She had to know what was going on inside. With trembling hands, Lily pushed the door open. The house was eerily quiet, the air thick with dust. The furniture was exactly where it had been, but there was no sign of Mrs. Marks. It was as if the house itself had frozen in time. Lily's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped inside, calling out her neighbor's name. No response, but then, as she walked deeper into the house, she noticed something strange. There was no sign of life. No pictures on the walls, no scent of incense or tea. The entire house felt abandoned. Lily's gaze fell on the mantelpiece, where a framed photograph sat. She walked over and picked it up, staring at the picture of Mrs. Marks as a young woman, smiling and radiant. But the unsettling thing was the date on the back, 1952. It was impossible. Lily had seen Mrs. Marks just a few days ago, yet this picture was decades old. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned around, suddenly feeling the weight of eyes on her. The house seemed to be closing in, the walls pressing tighter around her. She rushed toward the door, but as she reached for the handle, the door slammed shut. Lily screamed, pounding on the door, but there was no response from the outside. The house was alive with an oppressive silence, and her heart raced as she tried desperately to escape. The air grew colder, and she felt as though something unseen was lurking just beyond her reach, watching her every move. For what felt like an eternity, Lily was trapped in the house, her pulse pounding in her ears. The house had become a labyrinth, each hallway and room shifting and warping as though the house itself was alive. The whispers returned, soft at first, then growing louder until they filled the space with their chilling echoes. Lily, the voice was familiar, but it wasn't Mrs. Marks. It was a deep, unsettling voice, cold and twisted. "You shouldn't have come." Lily spun around, her heart racing. Standing in the doorway was a figure, cloaked in shadow, its features obscured by darkness. Slowly, the figure stepped forward, and Lily gasped in horror. It was Mrs. Marks, but she was not the same. Her face was hollow, her skin pale and cracked, as though it had been rotting for years. Her eyes were hollow pits, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. She opened her mouth to speak, but all that escaped was a low, guttural hiss. "You're too late," the figure rasped. "The house is mine, and now so are you." The last thing Lily saw was the figure reaching for her, its cold fingers brushing against her skin. The house seemed to close in around her, swallowing her whole. The next morning, Lily's parents were frantic when they discovered she was missing. They contacted the police, and the neighborhood was scoured for any signs of her. But there was no trace of Lily. The house, however, stood silent and unmoving, as if nothing had ever happened. Weeks later, the house at the end of the street was sold again, to a young couple who had no idea of its dark past. But every now and then, someone would notice a flicker of light from the window, and the whispers would start again, soft at first, then growing louder, until they were unmistakable. And in the dark, in the quiet of the night, you might hear a faint voice calling from the house, "You shouldn't have come.